Singapore ranks among the world's top 10 for innovation inputs, yet struggles to turn ideas into market-ready products. Despite major R&D funding and startup SG equity, scale-up and commercialization remain key challenges. To discuss what's happening, we are joined by Glenn Ray of Black Box Research and Ravi K. from Frost & Sullivan. Welcome, Glenn and Ravi. Let's begin with a bit of context for our viewers. What factors explain Singapore's strength in innovation inputs but slower progress in outputs?
As you can see, Singapore holds number one position in terms of innovation input. I would say primarily due to its strength of the institutions, proactive government policies, a high level of support for research innovation, mainly at the PMO level, a world-class education system all the way from primary to tertiary, IP protection, and last but not least, I would say is in terms of the trust from all the stakeholders, especially in the government and Singapore as a brand, right? But there are issues or factors, I think, that definitely slows the output progress, right? As we have seen the current positioning. I would say number one is the small domestic market, right? And also the high operating costs, plus the limited local manufacturing. I think all these factors force the startups to internationalize early on, thereby increasing the go-to-market risk. And I would also say elongating the payback cycle compared to a large economy. Also, Singapore as a country is not a natural first adopter for many of these innovative products. So the founders have to look overseas prematurely in some cases. I think the third factor, which is also quite significant, is that the kind of fear of failure, I would say, rate in Singapore is supposedly higher than a global average. I would say signaling some kind of hesitation, right? And also generally, I think the young graduates and I think the professionals in Singapore have very predictable career paths in terms of the jobs. So I would say the entrepreneurship doesn't naturally come as a first choice.
I know the innovation index that we're speaking about today ranked Singapore as number 9 in terms of innovation outputs. But I saw elsewhere in that same report something a little bit more concerning, actually, is the fact that Singapore ranked 99th in terms of trademarks by origins. So that really does demonstrate a huge problem in Singapore moving beyond creating good innovative IP and actually creating defensible commercial IP to take forward into the marketplace. And I think we can attribute this to a bit of a scale-up chasm, really. The ecosystem here in Singapore is very good and quite active and vibrant at the early stage, seeding and Series A investment. But it's more when we come to the late stage B and C series funding where the real challenge exists. And this is because a lot of VCs and investors, they look at deep tech with some skepticism because deep tech development takes a lot of time. And I think all of us know the VCs tend not to want to wait too long for their profits. So that's one big problem. VCs also, if they're being asked to write a $50 million or $100 million check, they need to see proof, a lot more than proof of concept. They need to see proof of path to profit, really. And the problem with Singapore is that it's a small country and we don't have a huge domestic market and customer base for tech startups to be able to prove themselves. I think we also need to look a little bit at the actual research and innovation ecosystem we have here in Singapore within that. The institutions we have are, like I said, fantastic, world-class. But I think over time it's kind of evolved into having a bit of a supply-push model. So what we really need is more of a demand-pull model instead, where the market needs are central to the research agendas and the research focus. So this is what we see in the US, for example, where institutions like MIT and Stanford really have commercial outcomes as the heart and soul of their entire culture and ethos.
Coming from that, how well are current initiatives like Startup SG Equity addressing the scale-up challenge?
Startup SG Equity is a necessary intervention and has been highly effective at being an early stage risk mitigator and quality filter, really. And again, this is more if you think of that journey of funding, this particular scheme is really focused more at the early stage funding again. And it has been successful at that. It's a generous scheme. I believe it offers funding of up to 70 to 30% on the government side, and it can go as high as $8 million for deep tech solutions. So the government is playing an important role there at validating early stage projects and de-risking it really for other investors to potentially come in as well and take it to the next stage. But the perennial problem really will be as you move further along that funding journey is we're still missing VCs or investors ready to write those $100 million checks. And I don't think the government can be expected to do that directly. But perhaps moving forward, some policy tuning and things like that can be put in place to try and encourage and incentivize those checks to be written from VCs or from elsewhere in the private sector.
I think the startup SG equity has scaled materially over the years. So far, about 3 billion has been invested in about 330 startups. Almost 2.5 billion is from the private co-investors, thus having a very strong catalytic effect. But if you compare that with, say, Korea's TIPS, TIPS is basically Tech Incubator Program for Startup Korea. They have supported about 3,700 startups, and collectively, these companies have raised about $12 billion as a follow-on investment. So you can see the difference in scale, right, between, say, what Singapore is doing and what Korea has been doing, right? Of course, Singapore has, I would say, been the whole startup SG, the program has been evolving. I think the investment caps and ratios have been lifted, broadening support into the late growth stage. I think the government has added about $40 million to kind of expand fund of funds via IDBI to attract prominent global VCs. I think other initiatives like Seeds Capital, SG Innovate, I think have widened partner panels. We also see complementary platforms like, I think, Enterprise SG Scale Up, Stage One, the One-Stop Shop Hub, etc. I think they are helping to build capability and market access.
Speaking of best practices, just as what Ravi mentioned, if you were to give recommendations, how can Singapore improve the link between research institutions and industry?
We really need to think of going from a startup nation to a scale-up nation. So to do that, and it relates to what I said earlier, we need a systematic pivot from research supply push model to a more market-led demand pull one. Government could potentially look at its policy toolkit and perhaps be a little bit more forceful and aggressive in terms of mandating government-linked companies and some of the large local enterprises to become anchor customers for some of the most promising tech that comes from Singapore's shores. Researchers need to be rewarded not just on a basis of, how much they've published and how many grants they've been successful in achieving, but maybe incentivize more towards how many licenses has your work created, how much profit has it later engendered in the private sector. This might be a better way of, incentivizing a bit more speedy market-led research rather than research for research's sake, if that's fair.
They could also potentially look at, I would say, building sectoral testbeds and living labs that integrate research institutions, corporates, and regulators to create, I would say, early reference customers. We see some movement in semiconductors, possibly the biomanufacturing, sustainability, climate tech could be areas to focus there. We also, I would say, can look at incentivizing corporate demand, possibly even the government demand, government procurement, having certain targets, regulated sandboxes, so that I think the large buyers can validate startups, as we've seen in Finland, especially through VTT. In fact, here Frost & Sullivan did a study for Singapore Semicon Industry Association, and I think one of the recommendations we provided is to really having an open innovation model kind of approach where the large corporates can possibly have a system of putting out specific problem statements, which I think the local SMEs and the startups can participate in and then support in co-developing technologies and innovation. I think that there's a lot of options out there.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Glenn and Ravi.
It was my pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Once again, those were Glenn Ray, Head of Strategy and Marketing at Black Box Research, and Ravi K, Managing Director for Asia Pacific at Frost & Sullivan. For more news, visit sbr.com.sg.